All right, welcome to Religious Experience. Our talk today over this topic, I will let you do the readings. We're going to read William James, William Rowe. For your class, I don't think we're going to have the Richard Swinburne article, so I'll cover important points for his strong justification thesis of religious experience. And yeah, we can have a profitable discussion on the discussion board. All right. We are live in Mason, Ohio. It is the 20th of April, 2015. That is not true, that date. Okay, if you can, start with this video. If you get on YouTube and look at religious experience, basically this is a nice survey of some of the top philosophers. You have a scientific naturalist on there, Patricia Churchland, and she gives a naturalist view. The narrator mentions Richard Swinburne's criteria. Then you have William Alston. He gives some comments, and then you have William Lane Craig, and he actually gives his testimony at the end of that 9-minute segment. And I forget who else is on there, but there's some Keith Ward's on there. And I met him at a conference back in '96. Craig was my old professor. I've hung out with Paul Churchland and my friend John. Patricia Churchland's coming to give a big lecture series at Mississippi State this spring. All right, anyway. Excuse me. Those of you who have this textbook, you can get it out. Or here's a free online textbook if you want. And I don't think this is what... I think it's called Mysticism in your book. All right. Okay, Introduction to Religious Experience, what you need to know for exams. We need to think about the importance of this issue and the possible evidential value of a religious experience for justification and faith in God, and so on. Or, and with other worldviews, for the truth of Buddhism and the enlightenment of the Buddha. And then Richard Swinburne's view. Yes. All right. First, be able to roughly explain St. Augustine's emotional conversion, or conversion to faith or trust in God from his intellectual conversion. We also want to look at two principles of rationality. These are from Swinburne: principle of credulity, the principle of testimony. The philosophy of perception is important too. I'll put on the quiz some of these distinctions between simple seeing, seeing as, and seeing that. Also, know the difference between the weak justification thesis and the strong justification thesis, and have your own view. And we'll argue that on the discussion board. Know the objection from neuroscience and the problems with that. The pluralism objection, reply to religious experience, and the objections that I give to the pluralism objection. I'm sure they're not my own, but there they are. Okay. We should distinguish between the New Testament view of faith versus kind of the common view of faith that you have being thrown around on TV and in the media. So most people in our culture use the term faith to denote blind faith against the evidence. All right? Now, you can use terms however you want, but be careful because the early Christians did not use the term in that way. All right? So they might get upset and annoyed. Okay, you don't shove that view of faith on me. My faith is different. My faith is a trust in things that I know to be true. Okay? Or if I don't know them to be true, at least I have very good reasons to believe they're true. Jesus and Peter and Paul were clearly men of reason. If you look up throughout the Gospels, what did Jesus say? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength. So, some philosophers think implicit in that is if you can't love your God with all your mind, then there's a real problem. Peter said, in 1 Peter 3:15, be able to give a reason for the hope you have within you with meekness and fear. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, hey, if this is false, if this stuff is not true, we are to be pitied of all men. If we're dying for this, this is bad. This is terrible. All right. But also in the New Testament, they taught, I think, a good balance of mind and heart, of intellectualism and mysticism. All right? There was a good balance of both. So, we can distinguish a belief that something is true, a belief that a belief that Jesus was raised from the dead, and that's different than faith. Because remember, if Christianity is true, even the demons believe, but they do not have faith. They do not trust their lives with the person of Jesus. All right? So faith usually is trust in a person. It might be in a bridge or in a car or something like that, but usually it is in a person. All right? So, we get married and we have faith that our spouse will be, faithful and we'll be committed to this marriage. I have faith in you students to some degree, that you're not going to cheat. I mean, I catch cheaters every once in a while, but that kind of thing. So we trust in and we operate on this faith. Now, and we usually have pretty good reason to. Most people don't get married completely blind. They actually have a cumulative case argument why this person might be a good spouse, and so on. So that faith is justified. Even if though it's not known with certainty, that trust is not without reasons to believe that your spouse is such and such. All right. So, why is the religious experience issue important? It just might push you off the epistemic fence. So take the example of Christianity. So remember Roderick Chisholm's epistemic scale, right? Counterbalance was in the middle, and you have absolute certainty at the top or bottom, beyond reasonable doubt, in the clear, such and such. All right? So let's just say that you've surveyed the philosophical arguments for God's existence, the Kalam, the fine-tuning design argument by Robin Collins, the moral argument by William Sorley, William Lane Craig, C.S. Lewis, the argument from consciousness or mind by J.P. Moreland, Richard Swinburne, and others. And you've also looked at the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Okay? And you're like, yeah, maybe, but I'm not sold. All right? And you also look at the existential evidence of Jesus' description of the human condition and the path to growth. All right? That, for me, is one of the big things. Jesus' analysis of humans versus the Buddhas versus Karl Marx versus Rousseau and the Jacobins and the French Revolution. I think Jesus gets it right. But you have to check that out for yourself. All right. Say you've looked at all this stuff, compared it to other worldviews, and you're like, you know what, this could be true. Or this probably is true, but I don't know. Or you're actually convinced it's true, but something else is holding you back from actually committing your life to being a disciple of Jesus. What you might need is a religious experience. Okay? You might need an experience for God to show up and show you that he or she is personal, cares about you, and is worthy of your trust. All right? So, that's happened in history. I love the Confessions. Some of the parts you can skip. So, if you're interested, email me and I'll tell you. I can send you study guides if you want reading responses. But what I like about this, he had an intellectual, he was a philosopher, intellectual, and he had his intellectual conversion first. But then his emotional conversion, where he decided to have faith or a volitional trust in God, that came later. As you'll see, he talks about sex all the time in the Confessions, and his lust was a big obstacle, and his desire not to pursue chastity that kept him from God. All right. What I love Augustine. Even if Christianity is false, I think we can all praise Augustine because this guy switched worldviews 3 different times. And I just like his honesty, and he just was like, wow, Manichaean dualism, that's the thing. Then he was convinced by the Neoplatonists. Wow, this is true. And then he's like, wow, Christian theism is better than Neoplatonism. And so he had his intellectual conversion, thought there were great reasons to believe Christianity, and he didn't, but he still did not want to trust or have that faith in God. But it wasn't until his incident, the Take Up and Read incident, you can read. If you go to Book 8, Chapter 12, I've got here, you can look that up online. Or there's a film, St. Augustine, and the conversion scene from the film is in there. I don't think it's quite accurate to the text, but you get the point. But yeah. All right. I had another good friend. This guy and I lived together, and he's one of my best friends, and he's a naturalist. Excuse me. And in the beginning, he used to try to deconstruct me all the time. Oh, the only reason why you believe in the soul is because you're a Christian. And I'm like, no. Here are these 5 arguments for the soul. Oh, the only reason I believe you this and this is because you want this and this to be true. I'm like, no. Listen to these arguments. So, over this whole year, I had the best time with him. And we would argue, we calculated it like 10 to 25 hours a week. It was ridiculous. So we'd be grading together or doing class prep. We're both teachers. And just get off on some tangent. And at one point at the end of the year, he's like, you know what? I think naturalism is still more reasonable, but I don't think Christianity is a joke that I thought it was. That there are actually arguments for the existence of the soul or the mind, for dualism. And there are arguments for God's existence. I don't find them to be convincing, but there are, and this is plausible evidence, and someone else might find them convincing. And so basically he was saying, yeah, you're not an idiot if you're a Christian. There's rational reasons to believe this. And there is some evidence for that Jesus rose from the dead. So he just was like convinced, I'm more convinced of naturalism, but I could be convinced to believe that God exists and that kind of thing, is what he said. So he was open. And I remember one night we were playing cards, playing poker, and he said, yeah, I'd be open to a religious experience. And he said, epistemically, I think that's what it would take for God to show me that he or she loves me and cares about my life and to push me over the edge into theism. So, there you have it. All right. What do you guys think about my naturalist friend's view? If you want to talk about this in the discussion board, bring it up. All right. So, and I think this is major progress. I mean, like, bless his heart, like, living in this culture, you think the arguments for religions are it's based on all blind faith. If you're raised in that, then you believe it, not for any good rational reason. And so that's why he was kind of shocked. Oh, yeah, there are actually reasons. I don't find them convincing, but it's like scientists disagreeing about a scientific theory. Oh, you know what? I think this explains the data better. You don't. So we agree to disagree. There you have it. Economic justice. Different philosophers are going to disagree about what's most reasonable, that kind of thing. All right, it's not just a blind faith. And what do you think? Are you open yourself, if you're on the epistemic fence, to religious experience? Now, of course, we're going to look at criteria. Like Richard Swinburne gives 3 criteria when we should trust someone's testimony or maybe even a religious experience ourselves. But yeah, I think we all have friends who've done things that are just, and they put a God stamp on it. And when I hear these stories, I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. That is not God. That has no justification in Scripture. And usually in the Christian family, in the Christian worldview, they say you need 3 tests. You need to test it with Scripture. So if God tells you to cut the heads off of 1,000 squirrels and then sacrifice them to Athena at the summer solstice, all right. Now, you know what? God says in Genesis we are to take care of creation, and I think that's not a good use of squirrels. Or if God tells you to do something horrific, Like I had a friend in college, and she became a skeptic because there was a guy up the road here in Lebanon or Mason, Ohio. He had schizophrenia. He said God told him to kill his mom, and he killed his mother. All right, that is something that you need to bounce off of the community and check with Scripture or the Bible. My buddy hates the word Scripture, so I apologize to those of you who hate that word also. But the point is that if you're in a certain religious tradition, God probably won't ask you to do things that don't cohere with, if you're a Christian, not going to cohere with Jesus' teachings. Does that make sense? That's how you can exclude your buddy who says, oh, the dog told me that I need to murder you, and the dog is actually God. You're like, all right, Jesus would not agree with that. There you have it. All right. So, think about your friends. Why don't you share some of these amusing stories on the discussion board? And yeah, what is a sign from God? What's not? Everybody's looking for signs. In junior high, my buddy was all obsessed about 11:11. Every time he see 11:11 on a clock, he'd scream, and he thought he was going to die. And in 2011, on November 11th, at 11:11 a.m. or something. All right, so Dallas Willard passed away, but his book on hearing God, I think, is very important. And even if you're not a Christian or a theist, giving that book to somebody who's seeing signs in the clouds and whatnot, and rolling dice, or using the magic 8 ball to see what God wants to tell her, give him or her that book, Hearing God. All right. Yeah. So, if you have friends, give them Hearing God by Dallas Willard. All things from God, or supposedly from God, need to be checked by, well, this is assuming Christianity. A community of wise believers. You talk to people in your church. Um, oh yeah, God told me I should become polygamous and I should marry 3 women in this church. Talk to some elders in the church who've been walking with God for years and see what they say before you go doing that. All right, and look at the Jesus and your own conscience. All right. Here's an interesting story. I'm actually going to meet him and his wife Thursday, but we actually taught a class for skeptics uh, 10 years ago at our church in Cincinnati. And he did the science stuff, I did the world religion stuff. But he told me back in the 70s, late 70s, he was a scientist, and he was like, you know what? I'm just going to be neutral on the God question. I'm a scientist, intellectual, and this is what cool people do. You can be neutral. Maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. I'm not going to follow God. I'm not going to not follow God. I'm just going to be in the middle. And he said that he was on vacation with his grandmother, and she was a Christian woman. She was actually the child of missionary parents in India, and they were all supposed to be on the Titanic. But through a series of circumstances, they missed a boat, they missed a train, they missed that trip across the ocean. So they did not get on the Titanic based on these strange factors that kept them from being on that voyage. All right. But one day, I think they're on vacation. He said his grandma was talking to him about God, and my buddy said, you know, I'm just Switzerland. I'm neutral on the God question, thinking that his grandmother would buy that. But she challenged him and said, hey, you know what? There actually is no such thing as Switzerland with God. All right? We're either working with her or him or against her or him. And so he says she encouraged him to pray and to get off the fence, one way or the other. So he said it was interesting. He prayed all day, went on some hikes. I think they're in North Carolina hills, whatever. And that night, he said, Saturday Night Live came on. The musical guest was Bob Dylan. And they played the song, Gotta Serve Somebody. If you guys don't know that song, you can look it up on YouTube. And they even have that Saturday Night Live clip. And this is how sometimes religious experiences are. They touch you in ways that nobody else gets it. But if God knows you and loves you, God's going to get to you how where you would know it. Okay? And that, Keith said, was justification for him. Okay? And after that, he said, you know what? I'm serving you, God. I'm off the fence. No more Switzerland. All right? So, if you're a strong justification thesis guy, you might be able to take this experience and know there's a God stamp. If you're weak, it'll serve to justify your own belief. So you might, if you're like Rowe or William James, you might hear about this experience and say, okay, you know what? That's just something I need to do then and pray myself to see if I have a religious experience and God touches me. All right. So I do want to mention one of my friends. She hadn't prayed in years. She either was an atheist or given up on God, but her mom asked her to pray for the safety of some kids. They were going on this Young Life trip to camp. She's like, no, Mom, I don't pray anymore. She said, please, daughter, please pray. So she prayed. And she said the next week, God showed up in 6 different ways to touch her. She had very weird religious conversations with 2 of her friends. Somebody else came in town. And then she said she had, the most powerful thing was a vision. And she said it was a dream, and it wasn't just a normal dream. She felt it had a different texture to it than a normal dream. And she said she was in this bar working, and she said she knew this bar was hell. And this guy came in with a blue candle, and she ignored him because she knew it was Jesus. And this guy sat in the corner with the blue candle, and she would serve him. And he said, hey, we can leave here whenever you want. And she refused him. She's like, no, I want to stay here. I want to stay here in hell. I don't want to go with you. And so Jesus finally left. And she said that just was so powerful to her. And she's like, you guys can't understand this. All I can say is God knows how to touch me. And he touched me through 5 different media that I can't explain to anybody else. But I know that God showed up to touch me and my personality and with all my interests and ways where I would recognize that she or he exists. All right. Point of all that stuff is there's some potential evidential value of religious experience for yourself and maybe for others. Okay? So think about it. What would help you believe, maybe push you over the edge if you're counterbalanced on the evidence for theism? Think about people close to you. You know, what if they had experience like Augustine or Paul or whatnot? What would kind of get you to question? All right? So, not just your own experience, religious experience, but what about the experiences of other people? As epistemologists, we do our philosophy of knowledge. We want to know how justified we are in dealing with the testimony of others. Okay? So, if you think the experiences of others will add to your own justification for the theistic hypothesis, in other words, giving you good reasons to believe God exists, then you agree with Swinburne and you adhere to the strong justification thesis. But if you think that religious experience only provides grounds for the person who had the experience, you adhere to the weak justification thesis. So that means that my friend with Bob Dylan, neuroscientist friend, and my other friend with the vision, those experiences justify their own faith in God, but they don't work to justify anybody else's faith in God. Okay? So that's what I want you to think about. Are you leaning more towards the weak or the strong justification thesis? Forgive me, I'm drinking some passion tea. All right, this is not necessarily a religious experience but I think it was a time, well, I mean, it was a religious experience to think that I think God put a desire in my head, in my heart. All right. This was a few years ago. I was living in Clifton, and I was training for the Honolulu Marathon. And I had to get up in the morning and do a long 17-mile run. And I was exhausted one night, and it was like about midnight. And all of a sudden, I remember standing there. I walked in my room, and I had this desire, call this my ex-girlfriend, this woman. And I remember, I was immediately alerted. I was like, this is out of the blue. I do not want to talk to her. I don't ever want to see her ever again in my entire life. I do not want to see her. I'm done ever. In fact, I thought she was going to come in and murder me and my two roommates. Okay, when we broke up months and months before. That's how bad I thought it was. And so I was like, wait a minute, is this a God? God, is this you telling me to call her? Because this is not from me. I do not want to talk to her. And so I was like, all right, God, I'll call her to see what's going on. I give her a call, and she says, I can't believe you just called. And we got kind of quiet, and then we started chit-chatting or whatever. And then a few minutes later, she's like, hold on a minute. She puts down the phone, goes and does something, and then comes back, and we chit-chat a little bit more, and then hang out and go to bed. And I was like, oh, obviously that was not at all something that came from God. I don't know where it came from. I could be crazy, but I think actually the devil can put thoughts in your minds too. If you read C.S. Lewis's Screw Tape Letters, especially I love the one by John Cleese where he reads it aloud. I think we can see that some thoughts come from the dark side and the light. I'm quoting Star Wars, but you know what I'm talking about. All right. Anyway, 2 weeks later she calls me and she's like, Tuffer, I can't believe you called me. I said, why? What's the deal? And she says, I just made a call to a special friend to come over and whatever. And because I was depressed and upset and that type of thing. And she said, I just got that on my knees. And I was like, wow, God, if you love me, please show me some way that you actually care about little old me. And she said, as soon as she hung up, I called right then. And she picked up the phone. That's why she's like, I can't believe you just called, and laughed. And so when she put down the phone, that was her going, when she went to the door to tell the guy to go home. Hey, go home. I'm going to bed. And then she locked the door, chatted him, and they said goodbye, and that type of thing. All right. Now, you decide what to do with this. I have a few more stories like this, but I'll spare you. Okay, is God personal or impersonal? Even if God exists, this God may not care about human beings. So deists are divided on how much God cares about us. Aristotle's on one extreme. So Aristotle thought God was necessary to be the prime mover, the uncaused cause, the necessarily existing being, the good, the designer. Okay, but God doesn't know we're down here. So prayer to God doesn't make any sense. God's not personal in the sense that God cares about us for Aristotle. Now you move to other deists like our founding fathers. So even Benjamin Franklin and Jefferson, even they thought they had more of a clockmaker God that would never show up in the person of Jesus Christ, they still thought you could pray to this God. So anyway, there's deists who are kind of all on this continuum spectrum. But maybe Aristotle would have been pushed to personal theism if he had a religious experience with God. Okay? What do you think? If you think, yeah, you know what, there's the fine-tuning argument. Robin Collins has convinced me the universe, the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the laws of physics is that there's a designer. And Craig has convinced you, with the Kalam, yeah, it's more reasonable to believe the personal cause of the universe, beginning of the universe. You know, that still might get you still kind of an Aristotelian God. But if you actually had God show up in your life in a vision or in thoughts or through some experience, then maybe that might push you off on the edge. push you off of the fence. Think about it. All right. Swinburne. Let me read his quote from his book, Is There a God? An omnipotent and perfectly good creator will seek to interact with his creatures, and in particular with human persons capable of knowing him. He has reason, as we have seen, to interact with the public world, occasionally making a difference to it in response to our prayers for particular needs. Yet God also will love each of us as individual creatures, and so has reason to intervene, perhaps in a non-miraculous way, violating no natural law, simply to show himself to particular individuals and to tell them things individual to themselves. In other words, to provide for them a vocation. One would expect there to be a religious experience in the sense of experiences apparently of God, experiences which seem to be the subject to be experiences of God. All right. So, those of you guys, if it's probable that God exists, maybe it's probable God would try to do some big things for all of us, but also maybe little things, individual things. All right. So, in the vein of this last thing, in other words, to provide them a vocation, maybe God would touch you in a way, in a dream, or through a Bob Dylan and your grandmother, or through a thought, or something like that. Okay? Or maybe setting up a series of events. I think all of us have had kind of serendipitous events where you have, or synchronicity, I forget what they call it, where all these things come together and it's like, this seems designed. This seems like a setup job that I ended up here at this time in this building to meet you. And so that was one domino that set this chain of events in motion to bring about some big thing. All right? So, now, if you're inclined to, yeah, you know what? If there is a God, maybe God would show up. One thing people don't do is seek enough. So if we skip down here, Jesus said, seek and you shall find. Knock at the door shall be opened unto you. But Peter Kreeft, Kreeft, he's at Boston College. He says implicit in that is also a promise. If you don't seek, you won't find. If you don't knock, you'll never have the door open. So I had a buddy. He said he was a seeker. He said he was a seeker, but I would give him articles. I would offer to talk about this stuff, but he was not seeking at all. And I just told him, I was like, dude, you're not a seeker. You say you are, but you're not reading anything. You're not even talking with me about this stuff. So be quiet. You're not seeking. You're content in your skepticism, agnosticism, atheism, whatever. And finally, he actually came around, and now we talk about this stuff. Okay? He still slips back into that mode sometimes. I'm like, dude, you realize what you're doing? So, anyway, that's something we all need to check with ourselves. Are we actually seeking? Have we ever looked? Or do we have psychological hang-ups and we don't want to believe in God's existence? All right. Evan Griffin, he's a professor down at UC, University of Cincinnati. He taught me this years ago, and I think it's effective. He got it from somewhere else. I don't know where it started. Maybe Schaeffer. The Atheist Prayer. God, if you exist, please show me where you are working in my life. God, if you exist, please show me where you are working in my life. This will open yourself up. This is a spiritual discipline of prayer where God could show up in a myriad ways to touch you. All right? So, skeptics, atheists, think about doing this existential experiment this semester, this summer. Just see what happens. Oh, Dallas Willard, the Husserl scholar, I used this a few years ago, but it's like a daily devotional. So even if you're skeptical, it gives you little spiritual exercises so you're trying. So if God's out there, God would be able to find you if you're seriously looking. All right, prolegomena. I've already talked 34 minutes. This is ridiculous. All right. This is in Le Puy, France. I lived in Saint-Étienne. I had house sat for some people for months, almost a year. And here is a little thing. You could read the story here, but a woman, I think it was actually 2,000 years ago, she climbed this mountain and laid on this slab and was miraculously healed and had a religious experience. Okay, but it's a pretty cool town. Check it out. All right, you're going to read a lot of this in Rowe, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this stuff, given that I've been talking 35 minutes. But there can be different types of religious experience, so be aware of this. And different philosophers have cataloged them. So you might have an experience of God, the divine. You might be aware of God's presence. Or you might be aware of a holy and good person. So, examples in the New Testament, you have Peter, when different times he's like, holy cow. When he threw a net in and caught too many fish, or sees Jesus do stuff, he's like, get away from me, I'm a sinner. So, seeing that, for me, it was taking a class with Dallas Willard. And we were reading through the top atheists on this Ontology of Knowledge class in June of 1997, May, June. And he sat there and prayed for Hillary Putnam and the class. And his prayer was so heartfelt for this guy who wrote Reason, Truth, and History and this naturalist. And I was like, oh my God. I just started crying. I just felt, get away from me. I'm a sinner. I felt like Peter being in the presence of Jesus to see that kind of holiness, living out Jesus' words to pray for your enemies. Anyway, mystical experiences, awareness of being one with God. Now, this is something to check out. You actually find this with Christian mystics too, and not just pantheistic or monistic mystics and other religions. So I don't think it's literally one, but you're going to have to analyze this stuff yourself. Sometimes there might be experience of being awareness of divine personages, a risen Christ. This is non-mystical. So Paul on the road to Damascus has appearance of Jesus. The experiences of the disciples seeing a risen Jesus, if those are true and veridical, there you have it. Introverted experiences, extroverted experiences, ineffable, those are indescribable experiences. Thomas Aquinas, 6 months before he died, I think it was December 6th in the 13th century, he basically had some kind of ineffable experience he couldn't describe of God. And he said, compared to this, everything I've written, all my volumes, is just like straw compared to this. So, non-sensuous experiences, not of the five senses. Propositional, it could be thoughts popping in your mind. A proposition is, there's a cat on the mat, or God loves me. So you could be aware of maybe certain propositions and experience. Veridical versus delusory. A veridical experience is one that is true. So yeah, anytime you have a veridical experience, it's not delusional, it's not hallucinatory. It's a true experience. Alright? So if there might not be if God doesn't exist, but if God exists and God's personal, there might be veridical experiences of God's presence that are actually caused by God. Now, as we'll talk about later, we can also stimulate nerves or neurons in the brain to recreate some of those experiences. Those would be hallucinatory, delusional experiences of God. Okay? But as we'll talk about, just because you can recreate it by firing some neurons doesn't mean that the original experience wasn't veridical. Just like I'm looking at a blue exercise ab ball right now. This experience, and I've got neurons firing in my visual cortex. All right, the V4 section of my brain, whatever it is. But you know, my buddy can go in there and he can attach some electrodes to some neurons, and he could fire those neurons up, and I'll have the same ball experience in my head in the lab. just because he can do that doesn't mean I didn't actually have an experience of a green ball right now. Does that make sense? So, just because we might have an experience of God, which causes some neurons to fire in our brains one time, just because a scientist can repeat neurons firing in the brain doesn't mean that first experience wasn't true or veridical. Just like experiencing a green ball. All right. Delusory experience is one that is an illusion or an hallucination. So cases of experiences of Yoda floating in your room are of these kind. All right. So the vast majority of New Testament scholars, both Christian and skeptics, believe that Jesus' disciples saw appearances of Jesus that changed their lives. So something happened to them that made them change their minds about Jesus from Good Friday to Easter Sunday. The question is whether those appearances were veridical or delusory. All right, belief versus experience. We're going to look up Rowe online, page 72. Rowe distinguishes between a mere belief that God is present and a real experience of God. So, if Jessica Alba parachutes in my backyard and I make the inference and come to believe my house sits on holy ground, that is one thing. If I actually walked around and experienced holiness in my backyard, that is something different. Here's my old Crown Vic, and I had 2 fire pits. There's my grill and my buddy down there. But I moved away a few years ago. All right. I know a lot of you guys have never been to Sunday school, so look up this, or read this passage right now. Freeze this and read Acts 9, 3-9. This is one of the paradigm experiences. The Apostle Paul. He was someone who hunted Christians and stood by as they were stoned to death. And so he enjoyed participating in the killing of Christians. But then something happened to him that changed his mind and knocked him over the edge. And he started following the person Jesus, whom he was trying to persecute. Rudolf Otto. Look this up in Rowe. Pause it and read this here. Get to know Otto's definition of a religious experience. Okay. He Meister Eckhart. He was of the 13th, 14th century. He had this different mystical experience. And let me mention some things, philosophy of perception. I'll put them on the quiz. But basically, some philosophers say that other philosophers are sloppy and don't make a distinction between descriptions of an experience and interpretations of an experience, religious or otherwise. So we may experience God and not realize it in a variety of religious experiences that are not mystical or ineffable. Okay? So let's see this. Perception. Simple seeing, seeing as, and seeing that. The IEP article, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and Perception, that I think is better than the Problem of Perception, but check them out. Simple seeing, I think this came from Augustine originally, but this is a very interesting distinction. So, simple seeing is perceiving something without applying concepts to the experience. You're just experiencing it. So, babies probably only simply see. Okay, you come out of the womb as an infant, and just all these experiences are bombarding your consciousness. All right, you're just colors and sounds, and you can't make them out. You don't know what's going on here. All right, now you might have a concept of your mother or of perhaps, but you know what I'm saying. So you put a big basketball in front of a kid's face. The kid doesn't see a basketball. The kid just sees a blob of orange. All right. You start yelling, for Reds baseball, and your kid doesn't know what's going on. Just hears noise. All right. So So you perceive something without applying concepts to the experience. Lots of us, when we hear a symphony for the first time as a kid, we cannot apply concepts. We just hear music. We don't know things. But seeing as is conceptual seeing or hearing, where you are able to apply concepts like red to the sensation of red. You're like, oh, that's redness. Now it's not this blob here. Oh, it's a red entity. And you might have the concept of apple. You see that this red blob is a red apple. You apply two concepts to it. All right. Seeing that is propositional seeing. So you can see that a proposition P is true. That apple is on the table. All right. Some examples of this. I remember when I started falling in love with Van Halen in 6th grade. The first tape I ever bought was 1984 with the song Jump, Panama, Hot for Teacher, and so on. Top Jimmy. I didn't know what a bass guitar was, but I'm like, well, Michael Anthony, he's a bassist. What does he play? What does that sound like? So I started listening, and my cousin Brett, pointed it out to me. Oh, this is a bass. That's a bass there. My cousin played bass in a band in high school, so he was like, that's the bass. So I started hearing songs. Instead of just simply hearing a Van Halen song, I would actually hear these certain notes as the bass part. Oh, that's the bass. That's Michael Anthony playing on his Jack Daniels bass. And so I was able to hear that and pick that out. I had a concept of a bass. I knew the bass noise. I could pick it out. Same thing with different instruments. Now you can hear different instruments. I played in band in junior high. And now you can hear a French horn, a trumpet, flute, piccolo, snare. You can hear the chimes. If you know these instruments, you won't just hear a symphony. You'll be able to hear things as they are. Does that make sense? All right. Let me skip ahead. Basically, this is interesting. Denial of simple seeing. Certain worldviews deny it. All right. And postmodernists will deny simple seeing because they think we are trapped by this postmodern helmet, which I've drawn on the board here in this classroom from a few years ago. Can you see this? The radical postmodern helmet? So basically, postmodernists think we're all trapped, like Nietzsche. We're all trapped by our DNA, our parents, our teachers, our friends, TV shows, Hollywood, language, culture, race, religion, history, whatever. All these things influence us to the point where we can't even discover reality if it exists. So postmodernists will say there's no such thing as simply seeing or being able to experience the outside world as it is. Everybody has a view from somewhere. Everybody is looking at the world through rose-colored glasses or worldview colored glasses. Does that make sense? If that doesn't make sense, post on the discussion board. All right. Philosophical naturalists also tend to deny simple seeing. Okay? Why? Because it seems like for simple seeing to exist, it implies dualism is true. You have to have a non-physical mind that can perceive, and Chisholm's adverbial theory perception. Now, so naturalists, they try to reduce things. All right, they either eliminate them, eliminative materialists like the Churchlands, as Pat Churchland, she's in the video you've seen. She's a limited materialist. They'll either eliminate sensations or they'll reduce them, either identify them with brain states or functionalize them. Tell an input-output story. And so yeah, seeing red is just input to the brain, processing by the brain, and outputs, shouting the word red, that type of thing. All right. So it's very interesting. Dualists tend to be more in favor of simple seeing than these other worldviews. All right. Pause it here if you want to another case to explain super simple seeing. All right. Birds flying over the river. There's a river where I saved those two kids, me and my buddy Greg. These two little kids, like 5 and 6, fell in the river and were drowning. We took them. Okay, here's a simple seeing example. I gave the example of Van Halen. So yeah, before I was simply hearing and not hearing it as a base. All right. Hopefully that makes sense. Um, this is an example for me. I remember I loved reading James Bond books when I was in second grade. So I would go to Montfort Heights Library and I would go to the adult section and get these James Bond books. Okay? And I remember this librarian, I can still see her face today. She's like, "You shouldn't be reading this. This is an adult book." And I'm like, "What's wrong with you?" in my mind. "What's wrong with you, woman? This is James Bond. There's nothing wrong with James Bond. Why is this adult?" And so I took offense that she was saying I couldn't read James Bond. It made no sense to me. But there was all this sex in these books. And so now I understand why it's in the adult section. Okay? So later, 10 years later, when I found out what sex was, all of a sudden, I still remembered like what was in those books, the contents of those books. And I was like, oh, that's what he meant by making love. Oh, that's what he meant by this and this. Oh. And I was like, wow, there was a lot of sex in these books that I remembered reading. And yes. So before they were just words, those just words went into my mind, and I couldn't see those words as actually something else. So you're able to reprocess some things. Does that make sense? You might revisit an old memory and be like, oh, you know what was going on in this situation? I had no idea but this actually was going on. All right, you get it. All right, postmodernism versus simple seeing. Read Thomas Kuhn. I like him. Um, in this book, Structure of Scientific Revolution, he explicitly denies simple seeing. Okay? He claims that all perception is seeing that. It's propositional seeing, not even conceptual seeing. Why? We're all trapped by our language and conceptual schemes, and we can only see through our postmodern helmets. All right? One problem is this. Well, how do we ever get into this language scheme in the first place? All right? Naturalism. Simple seeing is a problem for scientific atheists, or which usually endorse physicalism, or the view that there are no non-physical entities or souls, because simple seeing seems to be very dualistic in nature. It seems to imply there's a self or an I that perceives without applying concepts. So this is difficult for the reduction strategy. I already mentioned this, of either identifying, functionalizing, or eliminating particular mental states. It's much easier to dismiss simple seeing and claim that our minds are more like computers processing information than to say we are selves that perceive. Here was a year ago. There I am on the right with David Papineau, and he's written one of the best books on philosophical naturalism, published 2004, describing what naturalism is about. And yeah, I asked him if he still agrees with it. There's a part in there who consciousness is a decreed property, and he basically argues we're not conscious in that book. Okay. All right. Appearings. They may be epistemic or comparative. Now, Richard Swinburne makes this distinction. Excuse me. All right. So if something looks round, that means you think that thing there is actually round in reality. Or it seems elliptical. I know it is round in reality, but that sensation in my mind, the appearance is that of ellipticality. Okay? All right. So think about that, flipping a coin. You actually have the appearance of seeing an ellipsis when that thing is frozen in the air, let's say, or you see it at a certain point. It doesn't look around to you, that dime that's flipping in the air. It looks elliptical. But you actually know that it is a round entity. So an appearance versus kind of what you know it to be true, whether you talked about appearing or what it is. All right, that was clear as mud. Let's go to Richard Swinburne's Principles of Rationality. Basically, you're going to have a question. You have a question discussion board to see what you think about this. Do you agree with his argument for the strong justification thesis, or are you more inclined to agree with William James and William Rowe for the weak justification thesis? The principle of credulity. Quote, we ought to believe that things are the way they seem to be in the epistemic sense, unless and until we have evidence that we are mistaken. Okay? So, in the example of seeing a table or hearing a friend's voice, I ought to see, oh, I see a table. Oh, I hear a friend. That probably is my friend. So, we should take that as probably true until we have reason to think otherwise. Oh, wait a minute. My friend is in Africa right now, so I don't hear my friend's voice. Then you can revise your original belief. Okay? Or I see a table over there. Wait a minute. I just had 6 pounds of hallucinogenic shrooms. So I don't know if I should trust my senses. So all things being equal, we should believe what we hear and see until we have good reasons to believe otherwise. It's basically what Swinburne is saying. And I should believe you when you say you see a table or you heard a friend's voice, unless I know you've been having shrooms, or if I know your friend's in Africa, or I know you're a liar. Okay? Does that make sense? So why should we believe this principle of credulity? Swinburne argues, if you say the contrary, that you never trust appearances until it is proved that they are reliable, you will never have any beliefs at all. For what would show that appearances are reliable, except more of them? Now think about that for a minute. We won't dwell too much on it, but I think this is it's an important principle. All right. Here's a counter-argument. Religious experiences are different than sensations of tables and hearing a friend's voice. All right? Because Swinburne, in the strong justification thesis, he argues that we should trust our religious sense just like we trust our 5 ordinary senses. All right? Now, how does he respond? Listen. First, we apply the principle of credulity before we know what others experience. So I'm going to trust that you see the table or you heard a friend's voice, and okay, I'm just going to trust you and on your reports before anything else. Okay, and religious experiences often coincide with others' religious experiences. Okay, we might have similar ways. God might interact with us in similar ways. Okay, so it could be fairly common, like in worship. I had this one student, she was a skeptic, but she would still go to church sometimes, and she would be overwhelmed with emotion during some of the hymns and worship songs in the church experience. Okay, so my church here in Cincinnati Crossroads, like, it designs these worship experiences, so you might have a similar worship experience of God that's actually designed to evoke something like this. Or in the case of disciples, you might have all these appearances of Jesus. All right? So, and if you go back to Otto's definition and Meister Eckhart, their definition, they're saying that these are kind of similar experiences that mystics will have. So, that's his point. These aren't that unusual. Other people have had them in history, and so on. Now, what do you think? Is Swinburne's view plausible? He says this, quote, anyway, religious experiences often do coincide with those of many others in the general awareness of a power beyond ourselves guiding our lives, though not so much in a more detailed awareness of the exact nature of God and his particular purposes. Quote, if some people do not have these experiences, this suggests they are blind to religious realities. Just as someone's inability to see colors does not show that many of us who claim to see them are mistaken, only that he is colorblind. What do you think about this? Now, actually, I think this is my view. This is Dallas Willard's view and Peter Krefft's view, and others. If you never tune your spiritual sense, if you never do any spiritual disciplines, if you never pray the atheist prayer, then God might be talking to you all day, but you might not be able to pick up on it. We're psychological beings, and we are often not very perceptive to what others are telling us, body language and that type of thing. If you've seen, what was that Enigma Machine movie? Alan Turing talking about his Asperger's, where he just couldn't pick up on some of these clues and that type of thing. So I think that's very interesting. Think about it. Just because other people don't develop their spiritual sense to hear God or sense God, does that, in the same way, the blind person who doesn't have sight, he can yell at his friends and not believe in sight, but he just doesn't have that sense. Principal testimony, Swinburne argues. This is another basic principle of rationality. This says this, that those who do not have an experience of a certain type ought to believe any others when they say that they do, again in the absence of evidence of deceit or delusion. Alright? Quote, again, that those who do not have an experience of a certain type ought to believe any others when they say that they do, again in the absence of evidence of deceit or delusion. Okay? Now, he gives examples that this principle is required for doing history or geography or science. Alright? All things being equal, I should trust you when you tell me about your childhood. Okay? All things being equal, I should trust my grandparents when they tell me about their elementary school days. Alright? Or I should trust my parents when they talk to me about their history. Or geography, places they visited. Alright? This one guy who was in the Navy I met, he told me about this blowhole in Hanama Bay on Oahu. And I went with my family. And I said, guys, we're going to walk around this bay here, and there's a blowhole on the other side. This guy, I trust him. He said he spent a whole day there, how awesome it is. In this blowhole. Nobody believed me except one of my sisters. My parents and my other sister didn't believe me, so just me and one sister. We walked all the way around, and it was as he said. And I knew this guy had no reason to lie to me, and he was trying to advise me, so why not trust him? And so me and my one sister, we had a great time looking at the blowhole, looking at all the locals, goofing off in there, and we jumped in the big one, not the little one that sucks you through this tube, since it looked like a good way to die. All right. But think about it, and think about cases. So in philosophy, think about the principle of testimony. Unless you have good reason not to trust somebody. So we've got good reason to not trust our politicians sometimes. All right? We've got good reasons to think that some people delude themselves with drugs or they're tired. All right? And when our kids, our nieces and nephews, or friends who are children, they say, when we were kids, say they saw a monster or what have you, we tend not to trust them. Does that make sense? We'll go into more of this right now. All right. The SJT, Swinburne's strong justification thesis. Quote, in virtue of the principle of testimony, there became available to those of us who do not ourselves have religious experiences the reports of others who do, and to which, therefore, we can apply the principle of credulity. In the absence of counter-evidence, we ought to believe that things are as they seem to be to other people, and we do, of course, normally so assume. We trust the reports of others on what they see unless we have reason to suppose that they are lying or deceiving themselves or simply misobserving. We ought to do the same with the reports of religious experience. All right, what do you guys think? Is this strong justification thesis probable? Think of cases. So, given the principle of testimony and the principle of credulity, if there aren't counter-arguments, we should trust others and what they report. All right? That's what he's saying. And just like we do it in anything else, in geography and history, we should do it in other areas like religious experience. So, now there's three types of evidence against credulity. Number one, positive evidence of unreliable conditions. So, first we may have evidence that the apparent perception was made under conditions for which you have positive evidence that perceptions are unreliable. So, if your buddy claims to have read a page of a book 100 yards away, guess what? We don't believe his testimony. He is not credible anymore. Or, if your buddy just did some acid and he makes some claims, then you're like, all right, you know what? No, you're not credible anymore because you were doing LSD. So, since many religious experiences are obtained in sober states, they do not fall victim to this problem. All right? So, think about our wide variety of religious experiences where God shows up. Me, when I have a desire to call my friend, this and that. Appearances of Jesus, just to have an appearance of being loved by God or the sensation. All these religious experiences you can imagine. Think about them. And yeah, usually they're done in sober states. We might not trust our own experiences if we were on hallucinogenic drugs or drunk or what have you, or a big emotional experience. So there are times, when we should not trust ourselves, and as well when we shouldn't trust others. So think about it. Like Augustine's example, he was in a very sober state in that garden. All right? He was not working himself up. He was distraught. He was in the garden and praying. And then here's the children say, take up and read, and take up and read. And that verse changes his life. All right? Second type of evidence versus credulity is background knowledge. All right? So, quote, secondly, Swinburne says, we may have evidence in the particular case that things are not as they seem to be. So, if you tell me that you saw a man carrying his own head around campus, or you tell the rest of the class, most of us are going to be like, no, because of our background knowledge. We know that people don't survive and don't walk around with people carrying their own heads. So we're going to say either you're not credible and believe in that, or it was some illusion, it was delusional. We're not going to trust that as a veridical experience. So any case where a background knowledge claims to say something is impossible, that's where this is important. So, similarly, experiences apparently of God ought to be discounted if we have strong positive evidence that there is no God. Okay? So he's going to say, if all the arguments for God's existence are horrible, and all the arguments against God's existence, evil and naturalism, are vastly superior, then we might discount, of course, religious experiences. But if actually arguments for God's existence are decent, maybe they're not convincing above, but at least they're substantial, then maybe we should be open to it. All right. Secondly. So evaluate Swinburne's claim. He says, quote, likewise with religious experiences, if we have strong reason to suppose that there is no God, we ought to disregard our religious experiences as hallucinatory. But insofar as other evidence is ambiguous or counts against but not strongly against the existence of God, our experience, our own or that of many others, ought to tip in the balance in favor of God. So he's saying agnosticism would not count against religious experiences. Only an atheist with positive justification for the atheism would have reasons. What do you think about this? All right. So, if at least one of the arguments for God's existence is pretty good, then you have some evidence for theism. And that's sufficient to get us to trust someone else's religious experience. But if you actually have great reasons not to believe in God, then that's a different story. Tell us what you think. You have a question on this, on the DB. The last type of evidence against credulity is evidence of some other cause. Thirdly, there may be evidence that the apparent experience was not caused, whether directly or indirectly, by the object purportedly experienced. So, if you could show that some religious experience did not have God among its causes, that would show that it was not a genuine experience of God. I mentioned before, if a neuroscientist activates the neurons in the God region of your vein, or the mystical experience region of your brain, and you have a mystical experience, guess what? We have another cause. It was not God doing that. That was our neuroscientist friend firing these electrons in your brain. Okay? So, yeah, we should not trust someone's words in that case. All right? But if there is no neuroscientist firing neurons in the God part of the brain, he's saying we should trust him. All right. So, in conclusion, the onus is on the skeptic, given these two principles. In summary of the case of religious experiences, as in the case of all other experiences, the onus is on the skeptic to give reason for not believing what seems to be the case. The only way to defeat the claims of religious experience will be to show that the strong balance of evidence is that there is no God. In the absence of that strong balance, religious experience provides significant further evidence that there is a God. Now, I want you to evaluate this on the discussion board. What do you think? So this is pretty strong. He's saying religious experience is potentially like any other experience we have. So we should trust people in religious experience just like we should with any other report that they give. Unless, just like any other report, you have those three reasons to keep you from believing him. To review. If there's positive evidence of unreliable conditions, claim to read a book, page of 100 yards away, you're like, all right, these conditions were not good enough for you to report that you saw such and such walking down the road. Background knowledge of biology and this kind of thing. And thirdly, if there's evidence of another cause. All right. If you don't have any of those three things, then we should trust others, is what he says. So that's good evidence for God's existence. Other people's experiences, religious experiences of God. All right. I should have put this earlier. But the problem of recognizing God in religious experience, basically, if you ever read this chapter in 1 Samuel 3, little Samuel is hearing God, but he thinks it's Eli. So he keeps on going to Eli's room, and Eli's like, whoa, no, actually it's God talking to you. Do this. All right, so little Samuel had to be coached on how to hear God and how to deal with that. Dallas Willard, that's what his book, Hearing God, is about. Developing a conversational relationship with God where it's not based on crazy signs and symbols, but something more substantial. So just like the simple seeing and seeing as, this might be something that needs to be trained in all of us. Right? We need a concept of God for seeing something as God. If we have a false concept of God, we can miss it. Or if we acquire the correct concept later, we can see it for what it really was. Does that make sense? So once you learn about God and what it's like to hear God, you might go back to revisit some experience in your past, like, oh, that was God back then. Oh, that was this. Okay? Does that make sense? I'm going to add this discussion board. All right. We've been going an hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to fly through this. So read William Rowe. Well, let's just try to work through it. Rowe and the Principle of Credulity. Yeah, read this in Rowe. Pause it and read it in Rowe. Pause it. Um, Let me say this. All right, just because people have different religious experiences and different religions, that doesn't give us pluralism, I don't think. All right? We have to do careful philosophy and theology to weed out false conceptions of God and reality. Okay, just like Rowe said, we can know God is good and doubt that God gave Jeffrey Dahmer his life's mission. We may be able to say that. All right, if Jesus was who he said he was, we can test any claim where someone says, "Oh, God spoke to me and said I should chop up my mom and make hot dogs out of her." All right, guess what? That doesn't fit with Christianity, so that's false. William Rowe in this chapter seems to assume there's no way to weed out worldviews. But I would say this: no, we can weed out worldviews. As I see it, religions are just basically some of it. I think all religions have some grain of truth, but a lot of these things are just promoted by sociology, okay, and culture. So, Scientology, look at that religion, how it's been springing up. Mormonism, Sikhism, you have all these religions. Any one of you guys can start a religion and just say you get, with the internet, 2 billion followers. Does that mean your crazy religion, say you made it up and you're a liar? Why should we give deference just because you get 2 billion believers? Does that make sense? Just because you get more followers, this has nothing to do with whether or not it's true or not. But I think the Nazi religion, had a lot of followers. But I think all of us can know now that, you know what, that Nazi religion was just false. Ancient Greek polytheism, we think that religion is false about Zeus and Hera and so on. Does that make sense? So we can discover if religions are true or false, and some of them go away. There's always new ones springing up. Just look at Scientology and Mormonism in the last 150 years, or the last 300 years, Sikhism. These huge religions spring up. All right, whether they're true or false is another matter, but just because they exist doesn't mean. All right. Also, this is big here. Beware of the epistemic limits of what our experience justifies. What does this experience justify? All right, so an analogy here. Just because the Kalam cosmological argument might show that there's a personal cause to the beginning of the universe, it does not follow that Jesus was God incarnate. You need another argument for that. Does that make sense? You can't go beyond what arguments show. Also, did the religious experience confirm truth to that particular worldview, or did it just let the experiencer become aware of God? All right? So, does a religious experience of God confirm that Joseph Smith is a true prophet, or just that God cares and loves that individual? Now, I think this is important. You have people praying in all of these religions around the world. Just because God answers your prayer, that doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus was raised from the dead. It doesn't necessarily mean that Joseph Smith was a true prophet. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it just might mean that God exists and God loves you and answered that particular prayer. I hope that makes sense. Sometimes we can't go as far as some people want to go. All right? So, let me just tell you an example. I live with a Mormon lady. She was 80 something. I rented a room from her. I didn't live with her when I was in grad school in California. And I was taught that Mormons pray to the devil and that the devil answers Mormons' prayers. Okay, or I heard that somewhere. And then all of a sudden I was like, I just believe that without thinking about it. Then I get out there, I become a philosopher, and then I start reading some of these testimonial stories of the Mormon church. And all of a sudden I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. this is actually God answering the prayers of these Mormons. I recognize this God. This God has compassion on the weak, and God is doing this stuff. This is how God does stuff. Whether, I forget the story it was, of some healing or some providential thing to protect people, like the tornado thing in Iowa we read in Miracles. But does that make sense? But then I was like, also, just because God answers those prayers of Mormons, it doesn't mean that Joseph Smith is a true prophet. It just means God is answering those prayers. All right, so we've got to be careful both ways, like how we look at it. All right. Yeah, look at William Rowe versus Swinburne. J.P. Moreland. This God question book, I like this. I'd check this out. You skeptics, get that. My copy, a former student is reading it right now, and I'll be meeting with that student to discuss it. jpmoreland.com. All right. Neuroscience, the God part of the brain. So this, why am I going into this? Because this has been used to discredit all religious experiences. And this is still being thrown out there in Newsweek and Time and on the internet. And this is not a good argument behind it. All right. But so some people are trying to say, oh, this is background knowledge. We could fire some neurons and recreate these God experiences. Therefore, we should not trust people's religious experiences. Let's look at it. So studies have been done on monks and nuns who are having religious experiences of sorts. They've been put in the fMRI machines. The parts of the brains that experience increased blood flow, those times are measured. Therefore, we can roughly correlate certain brain activity with religious experiences. All right? So imagine that we could get enough electrodes to fire up all the neurons in the God part of the brain. If we fire those neurons, then the person would have a God-type experience. And it would be delusory. It would not be veridical. It would not be real. All right? So therefore, the no religious experiences are veridical. This is basically the argument. It needs to be formulated better, but that's the argument. All right? So, Patricia Churchland, you saw her in the Examine Life video. I guess she gave this argument. Maybe not in the part you're watching. All right, this is J.P. Moreland's critique of the argument. He says this: simply because we can locate and activate the part of the brain active when certain things are occurring does not mean that people have never had a veridical experience of God. In the same way, just because we can fire neurons in your visual cortex make you see red, it doesn't mean you've never seen red. Does that make sense? William Wainwright, in the Examine Life video, he's like, you know what? Most mystics are very sane, rational people who can evaluate their experiences. They can see what's going on. All right. So the principle of credulity is not challenged. Also, J.P. Moreland says that argument is horrible. It doesn't even follow. And he said this kind of argument would actually destroy science itself. All right. How? We'll run it the same way. Let's say we find out what parts of the brain are active when scientists read instruments and activate them to give them delusory experiences of reading instruments. So it would follow that no scientific inquiry of that kind was ever veridical. It's all delusory. But that's ridiculous. Does that make sense? So, religious experience, just because you can replicate a religious experience by firing neurons, doesn't mean people don't have God experiences. Just because you can duplicate sensation, someone seeing red in someone's brain by firing electrons, doesn't mean that person's never seen red. Just because you can duplicate through the firing of electrons the sensation a scientist would get in reading instruments, doesn't mean that a scientist has never read instruments properly. Does that make sense? So I think this is pretty effective. J.P. Moreland, this shows absolutely nothing. All right. All right, the problem of pluralism. Here is B. Alan Wallace. He wrote The Bridge of Quiescence. Hidden Dimensions. I've written a few papers on him. And I had him as a professor at UCLA for 2 classes on Buddhism. I was his MC at a conference in Palm Springs, California in 2001, and I hung out with them a little bit at 2004 Conference on Consciousness. And he told me to visit the monastery he helped found in Switzerland called Rabton Choling in Montpellier, Switzerland. It's an awesome little place. I'd love to take students there someday to do a little retreat if you want to study Buddhism. Problem of pluralism. People in all religions have similar experiences. What do we do about this problem? If you remember, this is like Hume's question, right? So, if persons in all religions have experience of the divine, what should we think? Does that mean all religions are true? Or does that mean maybe God speaks to all people through their cultural worldviews, which may be false? All right, remember the unsophisticated problem of pluralism. All religions cannot be true completely because they make contradictory claims about reality. But what do you think are some possible explanations of people in all religions having experiences of the divine? Oh, so I already did this. Mormons in California. In 96, I began to study LDS history. And you know what? And I think God, it rains on the just and the unjust. God loves the just and the unjust. All right. You can pause it and read it. Basically the same thing. I was like, wow, God is working in the Mormon church. Even though I don't think Joseph Smith is a true prophet, God loves Mormons and is answering their prayers. Okay? I saw that God answers the prayers of all people. So, this is my view. God answers the prayers of all people. The correct view of God is not had by everyone who prays, but the same loving, all-powerful God is doing the same prayer answering. Does that make sense? So Socrates didn't have the exactly correct conception of God. Ancient Greeks, they're praying to Zeus. Their concept of God wasn't perfect. But guess what? God was still answering some of their prayers. That's what I think. So even in false religions, God can be answering prayers of people. All right. Alan Wallace of Tsongkhapa's Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism argues that one can only truly know that the Buddha was truly enlightened if we could get to the state of quiescence. Now, as a tangent on Buddhism, I think this makes it epistemically terrible. If you can't, and compared to this, I think Christianity is 1,000 times more justifiable. We've got arguments for God's existence, historical evidence for the person of Jesus. If you can't know Buddhism is true until you meditate for years and achieve the state of quiescence, I think it's in serious trouble. But that's, anyhow. So, Wallace says this quote, "Any mediator who has not yet achieved quiescence is technically regarded as a novice. Once one has achieved this exceptional level of attention balance, one should be able to effortlessly remain there with the physical senses totally withdrawn for at least 4 hours with unwavering mindfulness and extraordinary degree of vividness." So Wallace argues, unlike Christians have to do, Buddhists can know, after years of practicing Buddhist spiritual disciplines, that this state of emptiness is real. And emptiness is a technical term in Tibetan Buddhism. It actually is a denial of substances or enduring entities that have intrinsic existence that are not dependent upon everything else. So it's very postmodern in nature, where we choose the reality of objects in each other. Wallace, in his book, Choosing Reality, A Buddhist View of Physics and the Mind, actually thinks that the Big Bang Theory became true once a critical mass of philosophers believed it in the 20th century. So we actually create reality by our minds. It's like what dreams may come. We think it, we can do it. It's like Green Lantern. If you think about it, you create reality by your beliefs. All right. Now, respectfully, I must disagree. In my view, Tibetan Buddhism, which is the worldview of Wallace and His Holiness Dalai Lama, takes a lot on faith and the trust and the testimony of Buddhists. much more so than a faith like Christianity, which has indirect evidence to support it. All right? So, for the sake of argument, let's assume quiescence is a religious experience. Let's assume Wallace's religious experience of quiescence is the same ineffable religious experience of a Christian mystic like St. John of the Cross. He's the guy who wrote The Dark Night of the Soul. Now, can Wallace and the Dalai Lama reasonably claim that this is the confirming experience that proves that the Siddhartha Gautama was truly enlightened? What do you think? All right. I think you can guess my answer. Just because Wallace can reach a state of quiescence, I don't think it doesn't have the confirming power that a religious experience of a personal God would. Okay? So I'm going to have another interpretation of quiescence experience. That I think God just designed us so that we can achieve these goals of meditation and these states. But I don't think it means the Buddha was enlightened. All right? They're not communing with the Buddha in the state of quiescence. All right? This just is something that might be true based on their interpretation of the Buddhist scriptures that should happen if Buddhism is true and emptiness is real, where you can actually experience emptiness. All right. So, all to say is, I think this is just very shaky. And we can talk about the discussion board. But he's awesome. He's brilliant. He's the nicest guy in the world. And I went over to the monastery in Switzerland. And Gonzar Rinpoche over there, he was actually very angry at Wallace many years after, because Wallace left. The Dalai Lama sent him to Amherst to get a PhD, and Wallace ended up falling in love and leaving the monkhood. And Gonzar Rinpoche still is a little upset. I should not probably say that and put that on YouTube. But there it is. Fantastic guy. All right. So, pluralism and religious experiences. I believe that the worldview of Christian theism is true. In this worldview, God is trying to reach all people in all times and draw them to the person of Jesus. That's why I think this worldview analysis is so important. We need to be careful thinkers and that can discover these internal contradictions and philosophical problems within worldviews. And that should be a goal of every lover of wisdom concurrent with truth. All right? In other words, next time somebody invents a Nazi religion, we got to be able to show, I think that some people in the Nazi religion had their prayers answered by God. All right? Maybe it was not for like to carry out evil things, but maybe a grandmother who bought the Nazi religion wholeheartedly, prayed for food one day, and then that happened or something. You know what I mean? So I think God even had mercy on people in very false religions like the Nazi religion sometimes. But just because a grandma gets a prayer answered and she gets food one day that she's starving, does that mean that Hitler is God and the Nazi religion is true? No. It just means that there's a God who loves her. Does that make sense? We need to be careful what our religious experiences justify. All right. So, I think philosophy can go a long way. I've been teaching world religions for years. Love it. And hopefully I'm fair and the best arguments for and best arguments against. But I think we can rank worldviews in terms of plausibility. I think the Nazi religion is at the bottom of the list. Heaven's Gate is at the bottom of the list. The Aum Shinrikyo cult in Japan that used sarin gas in 97, bottom of the list. All right? We can rank these world religions. Just because a religion has a lot of followers does not mean that it's true. So we can rank them based on other criteria, plausibility, different arguments, and so on. All right? So, I think we can rank worldviews in terms of plausibility, and religious experiences within false worldviews should be considered carefully. We should also be careful not to overstep our bounds in what they show to be true. So just because the grandmother gets some food, it doesn't mean Hitler is God. You know what I'm saying? So, here it is. Analogy prayer example. If you're a Mormon and your prayer is answered by the Heavenly Father, does that necessarily mean that Joseph Smith is a true prophet? No. if you're a Jew or Christian and God answers your prayers. Does that show whether or not Jesus was divine? No. Okay? All right. So, in a similar way, having a religious experience may not give you grounds to believe in a particular religion. In Christianity, Jesus' Apostle John talked about the self-authenticating witness of the Holy Spirit. 1 John 1. This is greater than the testimony of men. So we might expect, if Christianity is true, that God will help confirm through experience the most significant items, his or her existence, Jesus' presence, love, forgiveness, peace, etc. All right? So, some of these things, just because getting a loaf of bread and having that prayer for food answered, that's going to be different than the Holy Spirit actually telling you that some of the core doctrines of Christianity are true. All right? So the content of our religious experiences, that needs to be analyzed and looked at. And I think this is from William Lane Craig in his where yeah, actually God will reveal some of these things. Some of these doctrinal truths. The core ones. All right? Jesus' presence, love, forgiveness, peace. Not these little doctrinal things, but some of the big ones. All right, there's Samos Island in Greece, close to Turkey, close to Ephesus. Apostle Paul was in Samos. And Meteora, Greece, where they filmed For Your Eyes Only on the left. There I am with Antoine Arnaud, who wrote the Port Royal Logic. That's in the Palace of Versailles. I was with my godchild. There's a church in Turin, Italy. And again, online resources. Watch the Examine Life. Read all these philosophers' stuff. Look up mysticism. Look up religious epistemology. Look up perception. We'll discuss this stuff for a week, but you're not done with this stuff. Hopefully you'll be reading and dabbling on this, for a lifetime. And email me anytime, and we can talk about it. I'll give you resources. Here's some stuff from another class that I used, but we're not going to fool with it. This little bit's from James, Realized Religious Experience. Charles Finney. Interesting thing, if you want to pause it and read it. Pause it and read it if you want. C.D. Broad, remember we looked at him in Miracles. Gary Gutting in the 80s. Pause it, read it. Pause it, read it if you want. There's a definition of ineffable. If you want to stop there, read that. Indescribable to others. Here's some other objections that kind of in the vein of Swinburne, when we should not trust someone's religious experience. All right, that's it. Hope you guys enjoyed some of this. Hour and 39 minutes. And email me, let me know what's not clear. I can revise it for the next version. All right, see you guys. Bye. This is Tougher. 20 April 2015, Mason, Ohio.